Well, good morning to you all from sunny England. This morning, Friday, the 4th of April, we are focusing our attention today on international education. So welcome to you wherever you are in the world. This morning at 7:45, whatever time it is for you, I hope you are having a great day. Just a few notes about Friday Focus. We've got plans for guests over the next few months. We said last time, if there are people that if you're interested in joining us, or if you've got something to say, please drop us a line. The contact details will be at the bottom of the screen now, so if you can see that. If you're interested in joining us, or you want to know a little bit more about any of the programs that we're running, inquiry@smartcurriculum.net. Please do come and join us and get involved in this conversation around curriculum and how we organise our schools. But our focus today is on international education. So my guest is someone I've known for a number of years in schools in England, and has moved into the international space. So let me welcome to the stage Jules Knight. Welcome today. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
And I'd just say, Jules, that your sound sometimes just fades at the beginning, and I think that's probably. So where are you? Where are you in the world?
In Bahrain, and it's lovely 35 degrees outside and climbing.
Well, it's not that here, although it's actually it's slightly overcast, but that's nice to Dan, tell us a little about your educational journey. Now, we met in 2010, something like that. Yeah, it's quite a while ago now, but and that was in a school in East London, or South East London. Tell us about your journey from there.
I began teaching at Bexley Heath in 2004, became a head of year, and then in 2012 we decided to take the leap internationally. But the caveat to that is that the year prior, in 2011, a lot of my friends who were the NQTs and ECTs of the day had also made that leap. So Facebook and Instagram showed me all these beautiful beaches in Thailand and Bali. And there's me looking at the A2 every morning thinking, there's got to be a little bit more to life. So I had a good chat with my husband, and we had a baby at the time. He was 18 months old. And we thought, well, we can try it, and if we don't like it, we can come home. And that was in August 2012, and we haven't looked back. We first moved to Thailand for 4 years. I was head of English there at a lovely little school on the outskirts of Bangkok. Then I moved into deputy headship at another school in Bangkok. And then we moved to Bahrain in 2016 when our second son was 16 months old. And we've been based in Bahrain since then. But I've also worked in Saudi, and I've also worked across the region doing lots of workshops, teacher training and things like that. So very varied career. And I'm currently doing school improvement for an international school here in Bahrain, working with, I would say, majority Bahraini students and expatriate teachers. So very, very wide, diverse career since I've moved internationally.
It's interesting, you know that first attraction, and again, that it isn't a decision that I made. I stayed and worked in, I've worked in the English system for most of my career, and I'm that's a number that I'm the number is higher than I would like to admit. It's actually, this year is the 40th anniversary. I started in 1985, so it's been a career, but all in England, not for any particular reason, but I've known many staff who, like you, sort of saw those pictures, and in fact I've even encouraged one or two members of staff who've said, I've got itchy feet, I want to do something. Well, go and have a look. In fact, I've got a colleague, a geography colleague, who now has had half of her career teaching abroad, like you in actually probably Malaysia, probably more, and then Spain. So she's really expanded that. What is the attraction? What is it that it's not just that it's sunny and it's light, although that's a big attraction, I guess. What is it that how does the education system become that attractive? What is it about educating in the area you're in that that is that attractive?
I think that when we decided to make the move as a family, I certainly was in a position at my school in London where I had reached a head of year position, and it was tough. I had 356 children in my care. I had a 65% English timetable, and my eldest child was spending more time at his grandma's than he was at home with us. And the hours were just really, really difficult and really long. And I think that the biggest, almost the kind of, the stamp on, yet we're going to do it, was a moment when I had stayed in school until 9 p.m. waiting for social services to turn up for a safeguarding issue. And when the police came, they sent that child back home. And that for me was, why am I doing this if I'm not doing any real good or benefit? Why am I doing it? And heartbreaking as that sounds, it was the catalyst for a really big shift in the way that I saw education. And then when I went to Thailand, it was such a culture shock. I mean, you can't compare moving to a country and living there if you've just been there on holiday, which naively I did think it would be a little bit like that. But I'm in a school where it's predominantly Thai EAL speakers and very, very respectful. I had children walking away from my desk bowing backwards because it's rude to give a teacher your back. So I've gone from I wouldn't say chaos and mayhem of a school in London. Very, very different environments, but certainly in terms of respect and reverie for teaching, I went from somewhere where I didn't feel as respected to somewhere where I was highly respected. And that gave you confidence that, you were in charge of your classroom, you were in charge of your pedagogy, you could experiment, you could try new things. And teaching became really exciting, really exciting. And as head of English, I was able to improve the curriculum, bring in a new Key Stage 3, literature focus, and really start to look at all the things I would love to have done in London, but in a different context. Yeah. So it's fascinating. It's a really different way of looking at things.
So, I mean, that is the tune that I hear many people say. It's that sense of the experience is different and attractive. In our conversation, we've talked about this. What do you see as the biggest difference between, why is that the case? Because there's so many educators that I talk to say, they value the English education system. Maybe we'll come to why that is, but what is it that makes that difference between the English system as we have it, or the UK system, although the UK system is 4 different systems. Now we've got a devolved government. What makes that difference? What is it that's there that causes that? I mean, I'm not suggesting that children bowing, I can't see that happening in that London school. What is it? What's inherently there that makes that possible?
There's only one thing. I think it's a combination of respect, which is, huge, but also autonomy. You're not necessarily bound by the same rules as you are in the UK. So health and safety, for example, I had an EAL class of about 7 children, so smaller class sizes. And we did a documentary around the grounds of the school with a video camera. And, can you imagine trying to do that in a school in England where there would just be so many different hoops to jump through in order to get these children to do a fun and exciting project? And then halfway through the project, one of the boys broke his arm, not on the project. He was outside of school. They had to come up with a way of how they were going to incorporate this new broken arm into the documentary they were filming. And it's critical thinking, it's problem solving, it's a freedom in being able to give children more choice. And that was the first taste of what I saw as the biggest difference between, UK and international teaching. And then, Ofsted, the inspection processes here are not punitive. Yes, you get graded, and Thailand didn't have an inspection system, but you can come under the different regional, COBIS or Council of International Schools, for example. So you do get inspected, so you are held to account. But it's not in the same way that an Ofsted inspection puts that huge pressure on teachers. And It's really interesting because I think in the final couple of years in London, we had an Ofsted inspection, and I had run from a safeguarding pastoral care issue straight into my classroom, and I forgot to pick up a file which had all of my children's codes of SEN and registers and all of that, because I was genuinely very busy. And the comment at the end from the inspector was very glib. It was, had you have had that folder, that would have been an outstanding lesson. Fast forward 6 years, data protection meant you can't carry that information around anyway. So what made me a good teacher? Was it that folder, or was it the fact that I had a group of year 11 students who were moving from grade D into grade C? And it's the constant switches of focus, the constant having, you know, something happen in the news and the reaction rather than well thought out plans to help a situation. And you can see that in the current news at the moment. So it's an autonomy. You're not being tied by these strange caveats of Ofsted. There's so much to it. And then, you know, you get longer holidays. I mean, the average school year in Thailand and in Bahrain is 180 days. So that's 13 weeks of school holidays for the children and for staff. And you're given a rest period. You're really able to recuperate. Very rarely have I ever taken work home on a weekend, especially unless it was marking for exams or things like that. Yeah. The day is longer. We start usually at 8 o'clock or 7:30 and we go through till 3. But again, you don't mind putting the hours in if you know that at 4 o'clock you're out of the door and you're, you know, in a nice restaurant or in your garden or whatever it might be. So there's not one thing that makes international teaching, you know, attractive. It's a whole host of things.
And I asked the question, this is not about, you know, so young teachers out there, if you're watching this is not saying, you know, Chris isn't saying go abroad because it's a better life. The reality is that the system that we have in England is intensive, it is high pressured, it's high stakes. And I would ask, and after all those years of being in it, I asked the question, has actually done what we think that it should have done? Because there's clearly questions around, you know, in the English education system of whether it's sustainable now. You know, are we attracting enough teachers to it? And that's a question I would ask of the system. You know, if another system is looking more attractive, then there's something about what we're offering within this. Now, you know, the English education system is highly valued. It's respected around the world, but actually when you get to it, and one of the things I was going to say in that system, one of the things I talk to lots of leaders, and particularly international education leaders, about what is it that they respect, and it seems to be, and I'd like your view on this, Juliet. You know, is it the examination system? You just referred to it there, you know, putting time into marking and that the IGCSEs, GCEs, you know, the A levels and level 3 qualifications. Is that what's highly valued? Because that's a big business from England, and it certainly is attractive around the world as a measurement system. Is that what is valued?
When you look at the majority of international schools around the world, they're either US curriculum or UK curriculum. And I know it's the national curriculum of England, but we tend to call it British curriculum schools internationally. Yes. And what it gives a school is a perfect framework of success. It measures the outcomes from EYFS all the way through to, you know, sixth form. And it's a very easy way for a structure to be put into a school. And then within that, you then obviously have your measurable outcomes, your GCSEs or your A-levels or your BTECs, whatever the examinations are. And that's why it's respected, because it's such a good structure. But within that structure, I've certainly found that you can be much more creative away from the UK. You can actually have a little bit more freedom in terms of, you know, teaching texts. Or I think one of the things that made me feel very sad when I was leaving the UK as an English teacher was that we were so focused on the outcomes, the grades, that we then put that through the curriculum all the way through to Key Stage 3. So you had children learning Romeo and Juliet from year 7 through to year 11. That's going to kill a child if they're having to do that constantly, and just so that they can get those exam results. And that's what the difference is. In the UK, it's purely based on those exam results, whereas internationally, the exam results are super, super important because it's your school's reputation. But you have a a freedom and a willingness from the parents, the children, and from staff to be able to be a little bit more creative.
Yeah.
I just think school's a little bit more fun, and that's it.
I did just really. At our last episode, we spoke to Stephen Cook, who works with on the IPGCSE and the sort of international initial teacher training. But the resonance with what you've just said was about that, taking the children out of the classroom, doing something that's unfamiliar. He talked about placing children in unfamiliar circumstances and getting them to think critically, to get them to problem solve, to get them to work together. Now, that in a sense, that's part of, for me, that was, as a design technology teacher, I would do quite a bit of that in the general run of things, but it was about getting children to think differently, to challenge their perceptions about things, of what they'd been told at home or wherever they'd drawn that information from, to get them to consider things differently. So that unfamiliar circumstances was really quite key. And what you just said around that, a boy that's broken his arms and how we're going to respond, that's real. It's working together, working critically, thinking, problem solving is so key. And I think you're right that there's a point at which, and in a sense, it's a shame that it's the measurement that's the thing that's valued. But so just in your, how do you handle that? So you're going to deliver GCSEs or IGCSEs or GCSEs as A levels. And I'm glad to hear that you're doing some technical award subjects as well. So BTECs and CamNats and the others are in there as well. So what does it look like in terms of curriculum planning? How so you're doing English, I assume, and you're doing maths, but so how does the system work? What's going on within the system to get children ready for that measurement point?
Alone in themselves, they come with their syllabus, they come with their own 2-year programs. You don't really need to mess with that. But what I found, especially in the last couple of years where I've been doing lots of teacher training, is that if you can ignite children's passion down in primary school, down in EYFS, if you can get those basics and fundamentals right down there, then the GCSEs and the A levels become a really easy period of a child's life, because they've learned how to study, they've learned how to build skills in terms of team building, empathy, critical problem solving, whatever it might be. And I think the more creative a curriculum is in Key Stage 1, 2 and 3, the more chances of success you will have at GCSE and A level. But the only concern for me is always that we narrow children in the UK curriculum. We put them through these very, very tight hurdles. You go from 10 GCSEs to 4, maybe 5 A levels if they do that. And they have to be subject specialists by the age of 15, 16 through to 18. And that is really tough on a child. And how you keep that alive has to be having that passion lower down in the school. And that's where I think the curriculum needs a lot more diversity and a lot more creativity. One of the things that we did in a new school that I started here in Bahrain is we looked at the Oxford International Curriculum, right. And part of the core subject was well-being. So children were taught from nursery all the way through to year 9 skills about well-being. So a child would learn, age appropriately, about sleep patterns and the effect that has on the brain. They would learn about, social media and the effect that it can have on other people in the world around them. And they were being asked to be empathetic and sympathetic and have all of these really core skills that are needed to build resilience as you move through to GCSEs, A levels, on to university. So I think there are lots of really interesting models for curriculum, but if we can build in that sense of well-being and wellness and teach children how to be resilient, then the academic learning comes hand in hand.
Yeah. And again, that's the listeners will know. We've featured the work of people like Mark Oro Whiting and Emma Tibbetts on Foundations First, where their tune is singing around character education and really getting into exactly what you just resilience is one, but there's a whole description of character, empathy, sympathy, our, there's much that we can be teaching. I guess it's not, people have said to me, well, Chris, it is there in the English curriculum. Well, yeah, but it's a tiny unit that you do once for a couple of weeks and then you never see it. What you're talking about is embedding a kind of a love of learning, like the IB, in a sense. The theory of knowledge is kind of in there as which gets to the love of acquiring learning, isn't it? That's the essence of it. So
children,
go on.
I was to say, we're teaching children how to be better adults. It's got to start with mental health and well-being, and that has to start right down at nursery level. And when I had some year ones, they were having a little tussle in the playground, and they were able to sort the argument out by themselves. They were able to say, so and so needs to have 10-minute breathing, and this one needs to go and talk to his friend, and then they could come back together. So if we taught children how to, manage conflicts, manage friendships from that age, can you imagine what that would do for the self-esteem of a year 9 when all of those really challenging behaviours start to kick in about, smoking, vaping, drugs, alcohol? If they're able to make good decisions at year 1, they can make good decisions at, year 9. So for me, well-being should be part of the core curriculum. And again, it goes back to what we said earlier about having these really good ideas that are not particularly well thought through. And PHSE, the social emotional learning aspects of all these different things that come through have never been sustained. There's never been a point where we've said to the staff, actually, maths, English, science and mental health or wellbeing or PHSE has to be a mandatory core subject. And that's what's missing in UK schools, is there's not enough time to have children's pastoral needs looked after.
I think I would agree with you absolutely entirely. Let's in our having this conversation, Jules, there's a sense in which we assume what school looks like. So yeah. I wanted to kind of flip and ask you a question around, because a colleague of mine, and Andrew Fell, and I often talk about the children's lived experience, and when we go into schools, we're exploring. So what does it feel like and what does it look like to be a child in this school? So I kind of want to ask you that question, so in your current school, or a school that the one that you've put together, what would it look like for a child? So, you've got this year group of 100, 200, 300 children. What does it look like for them? What's their experience in a day? Who do they see? What are they doing?
School is its own unique ecosystem, and I've never worked in a school that has had the same makeup of children and same community. And that's really important, is that if we recognise each school's individual nature and we recognise individual communities, then we're best able to serve them. So my current school, as I said, is 97% Bahraini, and they come from an area in Bahrain that serves the BDF, which is the military. They serve the interior, the police force. So we already know who our families are and what their values are. So we can tap into those. And it's very easy to tap into your community when you know who your parents are. And in the school in Saudi, which was a fabulous school, it was the first inclusive school in Riyadh, we knew who our parents were. We knew who their values were. They valued inclusive education. They wanted their children to be in a class with children from all different backgrounds, diversity. And that's what their USP for the school was. So when you know who your community are, when you know how to serve them, then you know how to tap into those children's talents and passions and their expectations for their future. So I always wonder, when I'm looking at a school, who the wider communities, who do we serve? And then once we've got that, then we can start to think about how we can best serve the children within it. So typically in our school, my current school, they have a homeroom teacher, and then they have specialist lessons from year 1 up. And our kindergarten is mixed children from nursery through to KG1. But our school then segregates traditionally into girls and into boys. So we almost have 2 separate schools within the K-12 setting, which presents its challenges, as you can imagine. And it's about making sure that the teachers who are teaching the boys section understand how boys work in terms of their, physiological needs from grade 7 up. And obviously girls have a very different makeup and how they can be taught. So you're constantly having to think about your pedagogy. You constantly have to think about how you can be an adaptive practitioner in your classroom, because what will work really well for a boys group in grade 8 will not necessarily work for a girls group in grade 8. So we are constantly having those conversations about challenge, about stretching children, about making sure that they can see beyond the school gates. We are constantly talking to them about what their careers can look like, what universities that they can go to, so that you broaden their horizons. And for me, having children who can see more than one path, way to success, whatever that might look like, is so valuable, so valuable. But it starts with the parent community.
And so thinking about the higher grades, are they moving around? So you talked about the homeroom, so that they've got a base teacher, and that experience is the majority of their time now. So we've got, some in the English system, some primary schools or prep schools, if it's independent, will have that experience. They're basically in with building a relationship. So what you talked about, the pastoral care, is probably more prevalent at that stage, although perhaps it's very content oriented rather than individual oriented in terms of responding to the people. But later in the education, are they moving around the school in sense of English lessons and maths lessons and science lessons and that granularization of the subject domains, and they move to a specialist? Is that the experience?
Yeah, it happens. Bahrain's very interesting because the Ministry of Education here has mandated that all schools must have a school counsellor. So for every 200 children you must have a school counsellor for those 200 children. And under the UK system, you can use your heads of year as part of that system, which is good. But the government in the Middle East particularly are so focused on ensuring children have that hook into well-being that all schools have to have that school counsellor. The other difference, and I suppose the biggest kind of difference for me from the UK to here, is the emphasis on religion. Our children have to have their citizenship lessons. They have to have lessons in Islam and Quran, for example. So that takes up quite a huge chunk of the curriculum. And that is a cultural thing that runs all the way through the Middle East. And that's very different from the UK, where obviously the RSE programme is very broad. But I wonder how much of the cultural context and the way that schools are here put those social and societal morals in place from nursery, how much that impacts education as well. And that's something we don't necessarily see in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point, because one of the, you referred to, this question about a drama that's going around in England called Adolescence, and that one of the sort of comments around it is it's that how much is the parent, the parent responsibility for bringing up the child, and how much in England particularly has it been offloaded onto the teachers, and whether that's controllable or whether that's, so I talk a lot with school leaders around this. You don't hear so much these days, but the loco parentis bit. As soon as you leave the gate, then the teachers stands in loco for the child's sort of parenting. But that's had some detrimental effects in England. And one of the questions out of that is this thing called we refer to as the social contract. How parents are buying in to the system. You referred earlier, I think, in our conversation to the fact is that the parents are buying the education. There's a transaction involved here, which is true of the independent school market here in England. But the state sector it's there for everybody, and they should get involved in it because it's free. But when people stop getting involved, there has to be a question around why. And there's a big push at the moment on attendance. I think wrongly directed to punitive response, punish parents if they don't send the kids to school, but we're without questioning what we would refer to as the pull factors, what gets children into the school. Do you feel, in the international market that or the international education system, that there is a real pull factor? People, the children, the parents want the education.
International education is a transactional. Parents are paying money for schools, and the more money that's exchanged hands, the higher the expectations there are on both the child and on the school. And I do think that education is much more valued across the world. I do believe that parents, because it's a commodity and you pay for it, parents do put a higher value on that because it's an expense that comes out of your household budget. So there is that element to it. But I've also seen some real cases of neglect in international schools and something called affluent neglect, which is something I'd never heard of before I left the UK. So we constantly think that poverty is a factor in the decline of children's, standards, attendance, academic outcomes. But so's affluence, because a parent can turn around and say, well, we're taking our children off skiing to Aspen for 2 weeks, and you don't necessarily have any way of stopping that. Or they might be on business trips, or they might be leaving the nannies or the cooks and the cleaners to look after their children. So the children don't have that parent at home. So the schools here do have a parental role, definitely. But education is valued, and you can really see the children whose parents are behind them and pushing them. And you can also see the parents who are absent as well, because it does, both affluent and poverty will have an effect on academic outcomes. The other concern that I suppose I had when I started working in the Middle East was a focus on every child will be a doctor, every child will be an engineer. The creative subjects like dance or drama or PE don't tend to be taken up past GCSE, which is sad. And I had a gifted sportsman in my school in Bahrain a couple of years ago, and he desperately wanted to do PE GCSE and PE A level, but because his dad came from a banking background, he was like, nope, we need to do economics. And so you see children's parents making a lot more decisions about their choices at GCSE and choices at A level and choices of university. And I never really saw that in the UK. If your child wanted to do dance or drama, then parents pretty much allow them to do what they wished in the UK. So parents have a huge impact on our kids, for sure.
I think that, certainly in my experience of going through that journey, there is evidence of that. And I think that, there's a family characteristic, that the honour in a community to be one of those higher order professions. So, but the realism of whether this child has got what it takes to become a doctor, so they've got their chemistry, biology, physics and maths, or they've at A level, that they've gone through that. I find that the very black and white simplistic doctor, well, we all know that within the medical profession there's a whole lot of things that are in that spectrum of healthcare that every child is. And it's interesting to hear that that's a factor, but really interesting on that wealth and how that's impacting people's attitude, because in a sense that's an abdication of responsibility in the same way that we've seen some of it in England. I'm just going to pause for a minute, Julia, and we'll just do some of the other conversation. I'll be back to you in 1 second, just a moment now. So those are with us, please do like, follow and subscribe. If you're watching for the first time, join us on YouTube, where you can subscribe to the channel. You won't miss out any of the episodes. We're now approaching our 25th episode. We are Friday Focus goes out every other Friday morning. Our next one is actually here, Good Friday, here in the UK. Hopefully you'll be there. You'll probably be enjoying a break if you're in the UK, but please do come and join us. Like, share and subscribe. Join us on YouTube, here on LinkedIn. The episodes are live and continue, but please, thank you for those that have contributed, and obviously those of you that have joined us, you can comment. Please, we'll draw your comment in to the conversation, but thank you for being here, and just get involved where you can. So, Julia, the climate of schools, we've talked about the climate in the region is attractive because it's warm, where it's maybe not quite so warm here. I'm looking out the window. What's the climate of the schools like? You've referred to sort of bits of sort of the deference for the educators and the education system. What does it feel like in a school in the region?
Had a real chance to visit lots of schools within the regions, and you know what, it comes down to the leadership team. If you have a head teacher who is part of the community, who walks the corridors, who knows the children, then you have a really lovely school. And every school that I've been to that has that feel that you can't quite put your name on or give it a kind of feeling, it's because it has a dynamic head teacher leading it. And for me, head teachers are the real essence of and the powerhouses of good schools. And it's being a head teacher in a school here, you are more focused on admissions, you're more focused on marketing, you're more focused on making sure that there are bums on seats than you might be in the UK. So you do need to have a different kind of skill set. And certainly if I was to move back to the UK, I don't think I'd have the right skill set to be a state head teacher. I would probably have to go back down the rungs and climb up the ladder again, which is fine. But here, I've learned so much about business development. I've learned so much about marketing. I've learned so much about PR and all sorts of these things that you don't see that happen behind these big international schools. So if you're thinking about moving into international education, and I had a really good friend who moved from London. She was the head of a brilliant primary school in London. She came to Bahrain and she became a deputy head here. And I asked her, why don't you just go for a headship? And she said, because I don't know what I don't know. And that would be my reverse situation if I was coming back to the UK. I wouldn't know how to do the job of the head teachers in the UK. So I feel very much that every school is unique. You need to find your community, find the values. And I've talked about this with other teachers. Rather than having a school that you apply to become a head, look at the values of the school, look at the legacy of the school, and are you the right fit for that school? And because I don't believe you should go into an institution and change it and give it a complete makeover. Of course, you come in to do improvements, but you can't take away the essence of a good school. And I don't think you can put a name on that.
No, I recognise that, and I think that's. That there's a bit of the human condition in what you just described, that sense of I'm unsure of the unfamiliar, but it's the confidence that actually, because what I hear, Jules, what you've just described, I would say is absolutely what leaders in schools in England need. I mean, that view of attracting populations. We've got this idea that in the English system, with the sort of allocation of children within the state sector, means that they're just allocated to your school and 200 children or 300 children will just turn up in September. But the reality is, in the new kind of economy, you've got to have a USP. You need a unique selling point that attracts the community to say that yours is the school, because there's choice. So although it's not a paid choice, there is a choice for engagement. So having a marketing view, having a understanding your selling point, what makes you unique, I don't think is actually that unfamiliar here. It's just it hasn't got the ring of money around it, although lots of leaders will tell you that it does, because if we don't fill our role, we aren't going to have the money to employ the teachers that we currently have and run the education. So it's just context, isn't it? It's what you're familiar with in what you're describing is to bring money in to run the school. So if people are, that transfer between the education systems. So I'm not standing here saying English teachers go abroad because you should. I love you to stay here because we need educators to be here. But what I asked about the sort of the lived experience of the young people in terms of the children and what they're going to see in the school. But what about the lived experience of the teachers? And do you think there is that kind of easy transfer from system to system?
Most schools, because obviously when you're moving to countries, you have to have a visa to work there. So most systems that I've worked in require teachers to have a minimum of 2 years experience in the UK. And I would say that experience in the UK is invaluable in securing interviews at top institutions. I would never encourage teachers to jump straight into international education, and I would never encourage teachers to stay in the UK system. I would say you need to do what's best for you. But actually, what I found working in Asia, working in the Middle East, is the same as the UK. If you're passionate about children, if you love students, if you love teaching, then schools are the same the world over. It's just the view from the school gate that changes. But kids are essentially the same. There will be ones that don't do their homeworks. There will be ones that, come in late and, haven't tucked their shirts in. None of that changes. Kids are kids globally. And I think if teaching brings you joy, you can do that wherever you are in the world.
Yeah. As a school leader, I often, after our experience together at Bexley Heath, interviewing teachers, I often, hear that thing, I love my subject. And my question is, well, yeah, great. Okay. That's good. But do you love children? Because if you don't, what are you doing in education? And so many, they're committed to that knowledge and the content rather than teaching the young people that are kind of in front of them every day. So it's not an escape from that journey. You've still got to love.
You've got to love children. And, one of the things, I've got so many really gorgeous examples of how lovely kids are. I was reminded on Facebook a couple of years ago that children actually bought me a Mother's Day gift. They bought beautiful perfume and flowers because it was Mother's Day. And, I'd never had that in the UK. Not that I expected it or wanted it, but, you just get treated so differently here. I don't know how I would have stayed in the UK system I don't think I'd still be in education if I'd stayed in the UK. And that's the thing that keeps me almost awake, because I'm like, could I actually go home? Because our mantra's always been, well, if you don't like it, we'll just go home. And we've been saying that since 2012. But could I go home? Could I come home to the UK? Could I go and put my boots back on and go back into teaching English full time? Or could I go back into a headship or leadership? And that for me is now the fear. When I was leaving Bexley Heath, I actually had a job offer in Tottenham. It was easier for me to move to Thailand than it was for me to move to Tottenham. Imagine.
Wow. Yeah. Wow.
It was so much easier. And I think it was just because I was so weighed down by the system and it just felt heavy. Whereas I've never felt that heaviness teaching internationally. I've always felt the lightness and the joy that comes with being in a classroom with 25, 30 kids. And to be honest with you, when I'm having a bad day, as ever, I will go and plonk myself in nursery. I'll have, year one tell me that I've got funny eyes, or, I'll pop into a GCSE class and be asked a question I can't answer, because that's where the joy is. Yeah. And if you can keep that joy alive, I don't know where else you find it. What other profession gives you that joy? I don't know. You're speaking to someone that's been doing it for that time, and I don't get to be in the classroom so often these days, but there is nothing else than seeing a young person get something and the light bulb go on or the fire is started, and just see them express their knowledge and just show, well, I understand this now, and look at this, and what does this mean? That there is nothing else other than that. There's no, you can make the most complex piece of machinery in the world, but there's nothing more than being involved in that journey. I would agree with you entirely. And that's really interesting, that easier to go to Thailand than to Nottingham from sorry, Tottenham. Because we've lost that sense in England. I think that it is such a life-changing thing, moving from one institution to another. And I think that's partly because of that there's that huge high stakes element to the education system, the measurement so much of what we're doing and how we're doing it. As you referred back to that Ofsted earlier, did that folder really make the difference, because actually you knew the children? And that folder did make the difference, and it also made the head teacher at the time seem in a very different light, because that's what Ofsted does. It gives you a grading, and instead of all the good work that nobody sees that happens in schools, you get judged on that one event, that one singular outcome, and it can change the course of a person's life. And we saw that with that head teacher, bless her. It's really difficult for people to understand, if they're not in teaching, the pressures that comes under Ofsted. And as I said, because we are so constantly evolving and putting new things into place, that folder full of all that GDPR data, you can't have that in your classroom now. You can't have colour codes of who's who and what's what, because it's against human rights more than anything else. But that did make a difference, yeah. And it was very much that you're judging me on being a bad teacher, but you don't know what I've just spent the last hour dealing with, you know. So, and Ofsted don't necessarily look at they might look at attendance data, they might look at, you know, all the kind of the nitpicky stuff, but actually when they sit down and talk to teachers and find out who they are and what they do every day, I feel that the inspection process could have a really different impact. I mean, my vision for it, if I was ever going to be, you know, in charge of Ofsted, would be that you would have a team around a school, a team that gets to know the head teacher, gets to know the community, gets to know the teachers, because you then can build a proper school improvement programme. You can properly map out where a school's direction is headed. And often a school's direction is not dictated by what happens inside the school, it's what happens on the outside of the school. If your local sixth form closes down, or your local high street no longer has any jobs in, you know, wherever, that changes the makeup of that children's psyche within that community. So it's not, you know, it says that phrase, it takes a village to raise a child. You know, it takes a village to raise a school. And if you really are serious about school improvement, you would have a team that was dedicated to what's happening inside, but also what's happening outside.
You know, if you're involved, any listener here, if you're involved in making decisions about education, you know, some of the people that have been on the show over the time, I think back to Matt Pittman and his connection curriculum back last July, and the book, if you've seen the book, is exactly what you just said, Julia. It's been know your community and speak to the community and connect with your community. You know, just thinking through that, you know, we've talked about character and, you know, the need for well-being at the center of education, not just knowledge and retention and regurgitation of facts, you know, so the measurement of that system. There's so many things that we've spoken to, and I think actually that the one thing that I find most compelling is that in these conversations with people like you, Jules, you know, those that are involved on the ground, you know, your title, you know, school improvement advisor, you've been around schools and you'll look at exactly that. In fact, it was a part of the conversation I was having with a team yesterday that, you know, we want teachers to be aligned to the vision, but actually it comes through collaboration, and it's the village, it's collaboration that's the key factor. How do we do our specialist work together? How does that work? So look, you know, we could go on talking forever, Jules. There's so much here, you know, and being involved in schools at a level that, you know, this isn't intended to be a kind of whip to crack on the English system, and I think it has lost its way. If I'm honest, I think there are things that are there. If I ask you that kind of bold question, if there was one thing that you could change, what does your mind go to first? Where would you go? Whether that be not just the English system. Let's set that aside. If there was one thing in education that you could change, what would it be?
Time. I think that if we could give teachers more time, and meaningful time, not the time where you come out of a lesson, you just need to sort of sit in a quiet dark room because sometimes, it's been intense. Yeah. But time for teachers to collaborate, time for teachers to go into other classrooms, time for teachers to be able to have conversations. That would be my big thing. I think that's that 80%, 90% timetable with all the expectations has never shifted. And if you think about all of the admin work that teachers have to do, you know, in keeping children safe in schools, all of the really things that take up a lot of time, we've never given teachers back that time. So they're not actually planning and preparing lessons. A lot of the time they're either recovering because it's been an intensive day, or they are, you know, catching up on something that they missed 2 or 3 days ago. You know, so it's time for me would be the big factor. Yeah. And also, as a secondary school teacher who went from teaching seniors to year 1, that was the biggest learning curve. I would also have a teacher training program that saw you practice your craft in every single key stage. And because you learn so much about child development, child pedagogy, and if a teacher can control a year 1 class, they can control a year 10 class. And that for me is really important, looking at how we can be more collaborative. But you only get that through time.
Yeah. I would go. I don't know that there are many secondary school A-level, sixth form teachers. I can see them and almost hear them shuddering at the idea of going into a reception free flow. And I know I've had that conversation with many teachers, and I just whoa, I don't know, that's too much. But I think it's very true. It's when we appreciate the continuum of learning, when you get back to the core start principles, the concepts that you're trying to get over, I know, maths teachers will tell you this, we need to understand what's going on pre-11 to really get the foundations of maths and calculation and how the brain is responding. If we don't get that right, then cramming them for GCSE maths is actually really difficult.
I also appreciate, as an English teacher, and I'm guilty of this myself, that we would have year 7s come to us from the year 12 feeder schools in the UK, and we would be like, all we had to do today, children, is write a little paragraph. But what we didn't see, what was happening in primary in year 6, is those guys were writing pages and pages. And we bring them into secondary school and we suddenly treat them like babies. And actually, if you were a Key Stage 3 teacher, if you went into a primary school and saw what those children were capable of in year 4, 5 and 6, you would have a really different view about how to push those children through.
Yeah. There's a comment for, I don't know if you're a colleague or just that flying hours, learning across the phases. And I think, Sophie, it is something that, I guess, the length of time of being involved in the system. I know as a teacher, I got more confident about the concepts I was trying to get over as I learned more, and you get back to laying the foundations. But I think exactly, Julie, what you just said, so many educators in this segregated, I don't mean segregated in terms of gender, but segregated in terms of age, you do get into that habit of thinking, we're starting from ground zero. The difficulty is the consistency, isn't it? Because, across those 12 feeder schools, there were lots of different things going on, and whether you could start from a similar point, that was the biggest challenge, wasn't it? But then that's about
curriculum. That's curriculum, and that's the structure, and that's why I said to you at the beginning of this conversation that the national curriculum is a really good structure, because actually it brings all children to a certain point, obviously with variations in those points of entry and exit. But ultimately, if you had your English lead at the senior school talking to your English leads at the different primary schools and looking at, what texts they've studied or whatever they've learned, then you could put together a much more engaging curriculum further up the school. And that's the other issue with international schools that UK schools don't have. We tend to be K-12 schools, so we go all the way from nursery all the way through to A-level, so we can be much more aligned with what our colleagues are doing across the school in different phases. And you get to know the children from, if they stay all the way through, but you get to know children and families in a much more developed way. And maybe that's a model the UK should be looking at, rather than having these separate entities, actually have all through schools where communities can actually come from nursery all the way through to, sixth form. Perhaps that's the way forward.
I think there's some, I personally regret that within the Multi-Academy Trust setup, that it was kind of left to individuals to make that decision. I think there could have been, organisationally, much more of that flow. So they're, bearing in mind that in England, most of the intakes for infant primary schools are sort of 1 or 2 form entry schools, where most secondaries are 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 form entries. So the number of pupils in a year changes. So you'd need a secondary with a number of primaries. But how powerful would that be if they were working in that kind of synergist continuum?
too far on in some of the UK maths was that they tried to get teachers to teach the same lesson at the same time across all of their different schools. And I've got a friend who worked at a school in London with a multi-academy trust, and they used to do managed moves. And so the English teachers couldn't choose what different text to study because all of the MAT schools had to do the same text. And I was like, where is that? Or where is the creativity and the autonomy in that? You can't go off a lesson. And so there's a danger in autonomizing everything. And it goes back to that idea that schools need to be much more individual ecosystems. I don't know that MATs can be successful if they don't recognise the communities in which they serve.
Absolutely. And that's why Matt's work in Australia is so key. That idea of connecting with the community and the leaders. In fact, the Confederation of School Trusts here, so led by Leora Cruddas, she speaks a lot about the leaders being community, the education leaders being a centre in the community, and we come back to that whole kind of element of respect and not just status in hierarchy, but value the position and how important that position is in shaping, as you say, the education of the village, by the village, for the village, of the village. That's a key. And I guess systemization has kind of lost the view of that. We need to get back to some kind of ground zero of what this is about. A kind of final question, Julia. What in where you are now, what's the measure of a good education? What's valued in a child that is well educated? What's the view where you are?
I think that it's very difficult, isn't it, to quantify that? But if you have a child that grows up happy, confident, able to do public speaking, able to walk into rooms full of strangers and hold their own, that to me is a sign of a successful student, because they will be successful wherever they go in life. And I'd like to see a big focus on those skills coming through the curriculum. If we're really talking about how we make adults successful, it's being able to have these kinds of conversations across borders, having children that are able to kind of stand up and say, this is wrong, this is right, and this is what we believe in. So yeah, I don't necessarily think academic success is achievable for every child at certain points. I didn't go to university till I was 22. So, did that make me failure? Probably not.
And the truth is that life goes on, and we make decisions on the journey, and the fact that we can make those decisions at various different points, and everybody's different. I remember conversations with learners saying, well, I've got where I taught, before I got to Bexley Heath, we were dealing with a massive year groups where, it wasn't uncommon to have 16 pregnancies in the year. Now, traditionally, that was the end of education for those young ladies. Well, we turned that around and said, well, it doesn't have to be. You can continue your education. So we had, young ladies that did their degrees through Open University. Yes, they may have a young child, but it didn't stop the journey. And learning shouldn't be stopped because life circumstances change. Now, whether that was a choice or not, that's something that we won't go into here. But it's the fact that they could make good decisions for their future, and they had the confidence to do it, that mattered. But I think, having said what you said, sorry, go on.
We do hand over that key, and I just say to children, if you unlock your GCSEs, that makes the next part of your journey a bit easier. It doesn't make it impossible, but it makes it easier. And so the more you put in now, the quicker and easier the outcomes will be for you. And that's it. You just have to take it day by day.
Yeah, and they open doors. That's it. They open doors for you, and that's the key. We're in the business of lighting fires and opening doors. As far as I'm concerned, that's it. That sums up teaching entirely. Jules, absolute pleasure to talk to you again. I know you're on holiday and going back to work next week. Is that right? I wish you a successful term, and I'm sure we'll speak before too long. But thank you for joining us this morning.
Good day. Speak soon.
Thank you. Take care. Well, thank you. That was a very interesting conversation about education across the borders, and we will be continuing this conversation over future episodes. So we're back for Good Friday Focus in 2 weeks' time. If you're with us and you're watching on the recorded version, please do like and share the conversation. If you found it valuable, contribution would be really important. Thank you to those that are adding to the comment, and just see here, thank you for that kind of positivity, Jane. That's really appreciated. These conversations are intended to be an educational an eye-opening, just to get us involved in what's happening across the world and within the system. Obviously, I'm within the English education system, although increasingly beyond that with the work that we're doing within Smart Curriculum. If you're interested in what we're doing away from the podcast, please do get in contact. You can contact us through our usual channels, either email or phone, or use LinkedIn or YouTube to connect. Thank you for being here. We appreciate your listening to us, and we look forward to future episodes, and join us for the next one. Take care. Have a good day.